It was a gray Thursday morning in Brooklyn, the kind that made the city feel heavy and impatient. The hallway of the old apartment building smelled faintly of dust and paint thinner. Upstairs in apartment 4B, Gerald Whitmore, the landlord, stood with his arms crossed, glaring at a spreading stain on the ceiling. Unbelievable, he muttered. These people can't go 1 week without something breaking. A knock echoed through the hall. Gerald swung open the door to reveal a man in work boots and a faded navy coverall, toolbox in hand. He was tall, broad-shouldered, with warm brown skin and calm eyes that carried quiet patience, the kind earned by years of being talked down to. "Morning, sir," the man said. "I'm Derek Miles, the plumber. Got a call about a burst pipe?" Gerald snorted. "You took your time. It's been leaking since last night." "Sorry, sir," Derek said evenly. "Dispatch only sent me an hour ago. I'll take a look right away." Gerald gestured irritably toward the bathroom. Yeah, just fix it, and make it quick. Some of us have real work to do." Derek didn't reply. He opened his toolbox, knelt by the sink, and began his work. The sound of dripping filled the silence. Gerald paced behind him, muttering, "You people always say you'll fix something, and it ends up worse than before." Derek froze for half a second, then slowly stood, wiping his hands on a rag. "Excuse me?" "You heard me," Gerald said sharply. "Last guy that came here looked just like you, charged me double and still left a mess. You all think you can take advantage of people who actually own property." The words hung in the air like poison. Derek met his gaze calmly. "Sir, I'm just here to do my job." "Then do it and get out," Gerald snapped. "Don't scratch anything, don't make noise, and don't touch anything that isn't broken." For a long moment, Derek said nothing. Then he nodded slowly. "Yes, sir." He returned to his work, his movements steady and precise. The tension in the room was thick. Water hissed from the pipes as he tightened the wrench, adjusted the valve, and replaced the cracked section that had been leaking. Within 30 minutes, the sound stopped. "All fixed," he said quietly, turning off the main. "You're good to go now." Gerald checked under the sink, frowned, then muttered, "Huh, guess you did it right." He reached for his checkbook, but Derek shook his head. "No charge today." Gerald blinked. "What? You expect me to believe that?" Derek gave a faint smile. "No, sir. But sometimes it's not about the money." He packed his tools and started for the door. Before leaving, he turned back once more. "By the way, that pipe burst because of a pressure buildup. Happens when you ignore small leaks. Might want to check the one upstairs before it gets worse." And with that, he was gone. Gerald stared at the silent pipes, his own reflection flickering in the water-stained tiles. For reasons he couldn't explain, his chest felt heavier than before. He didn't know it yet, but Derek hadn't just fixed his plumbing. He'd started to fix something far deeper. 2 days later, the skies over Brooklyn opened up, pouring rain hard enough to make the streets glisten like mirrors. The old brownstone building groaned under the storm's weight. In apartment 4B, Gerald Whitmore sat at his kitchen table with a mug of coffee, flipping through overdue maintenance bills and grumbling under his breath. He'd barely finished his second sip when a sharp crack echoed through the walls, followed by a low rushing sound. Then came the unmistakable hiss of water. "Oh, for crying out loud," Gerald muttered, jumping up. He followed the noise to the basement stairwell and froze. A jet of water was spraying from the main line, flooding the floor fast. Within seconds, the cold water was pooling around his shoes. "No, no, no!" he shouted, running for the shutoff valve. He twisted it, but it barely budged. The handle was rusted, corroded, years of neglect catching up all at once. Within minutes, the water was ankle deep. He tried to call maintenance, but the line was busy. His temper flared. "Useless!" he barked. Then, almost against his pride, he found himself scrolling through his phone until he reached the contact he'd saved without thinking. Derek Miles, plumbing and repair. He hesitated for a long second before finally pressing call. "Mr. Whitmore?" Derek's calm voice answered over the sound of static. "It's me," Gerald said quickly. It's, it's flooding. The basement pipe burst again. You need to get here now." "I can come," Derek replied evenly, "but the roads are bad. Give me 30 minutes." "30 minutes?" Gerald snapped. "I don't have 30 minutes." The line went dead. By the time Derek arrived, the basement was a disaster. Water reached nearly a foot high. The circuit box sparked dangerously on the wall. Gerald stood by the stairs, drenched and panicking, clutching a flashlight. "Thank God you're here," he said. Derek set down his toolbox, unbothered by the chaos. "Told you about that pressure buildup," he said calmly, pulling on gloves. "Looks like it finally gave out." Gerald, desperate, followed him down the steps. "Can you fix it?" "I'll try," Derek said. "But we'll have to cut the main line to stop the flooding first." As Derek waded into the cold water, Gerald noticed his hands. Steady, deliberate, professional. The man who'd been calm even when insulted was now risking himself in a flooded basement to save his property. The irony hit hard. Should I do anything?" Gerald asked awkwardly. "Yeah," Derek said without looking up. "Stay where it's dry." For 20 minutes, Derek worked under the spray, tightening valves, replacing a burst fitting, and finally shutting down the flow. When the water stopped gushing, the silence was deafening. He exhaled and stood, soaked to the bone. "That should hold," he said, brushing water from his face. Gerald looked around the basement, the tools, the ruined boxes, the dripping walls. He felt something he hadn't in years: shame. "Mr. Miles," he said slowly, "I owe you an apology." Derek blinked. "For the pipe? For the way I spoke to you last time?" Gerald's voice cracked slightly. "You didn't deserve that. You were right. I ignored the warning signs. Not just in the pipes, but in myself." For the first time, Derek smiled, small but genuine. "Apology accepted, sir. But I wasn't fixing this place for you. I was fixing it so no one living here has to deal with what's broken." Gerald frowned. "What do you mean?" "You own this building," Derek said. "But the people living here, they're the ones holding it up. Without them, it's just bricks." Gerald stood silently, absorbing every word. Derek grabbed his tools and started for the stairs. "You might want to check the tenants upstairs," he added. "Water probably leaked into their walls. And next time, call sooner. For their sake, not yours." As Derek disappeared up the steps, Gerald looked down at his reflection in the murky water. For once, he didn't see a landlord with power. He saw a man who had been small and was finally starting to see it. And he didn't know it yet. But that broken pipe had opened something much deeper than the building's foundation. It had started to fix his heart. The storm damage had taken a week to clean up, but the conversation in the flooded basement lingered in Gerald Whitmore's mind far longer. For the first time, he began to notice things he had ignored for years: cracked walls, peeling paint, the way the tenants avoided him when he walked by. They didn't smile or greet him. They just closed their doors. He realized then that maybe it wasn't just the building that had been neglected. It was him. A few days later, Gerald decided to find Derek Miles again. He called the plumbing company, but they said Derek had gone independent, started his own business, Miles Home Repair and Restoration. Something about the name caught him. It didn't sound like a plumbing service. It sounded like a mission. The next morning, Gerald drove across town to the address listed online. It wasn't a fancy office, just an old workshop at the edge of an industrial block. When he stepped inside, the smell of sawdust and metal filled the air. Derek was there in a work apron, showing two apprentices how to fit copper joints. He looked up when he saw Gerald. "Mr. Whitmore," he said with a surprised smile. "Didn't expect to see you here?" Gerald rubbed the back of his neck awkwardly. "I came to thank you, properly this time. You saved me a lot of damage down there. I owe you more than money." Derek chuckled softly. "You already paid. You listened." Gerald nodded slowly. "I did. And now I can't unhear it. I want to do something right this time. You said something the other day about fixing things so people don't have to live with what's broken." "Yeah," Derek said, setting down his wrench. "That's kind of my thing." Gerald took a deep breath. "Then maybe you can help me again. I've got tenants, good people, living in bad conditions. Leaks, old wiring, broken heating. I've been too proud to admit it, but they deserve better. I want to rebuild the place right, not just patch it up." Derek's eyebrows rose. "That's a big project. You sure you're ready for that?" "For once," Gerald said. "I'm sure of something that's not about me." Derek studied him for a long moment, then nodded. "All right, I'll help. But if we do this, we do it right. No shortcuts, no cheap fixes. And no treating workers, like they're invisible. Gerald smiled faintly. Deal. Over the next few weeks, they worked side by side in the building. Derek brought his small crew, two young apprentices from the neighborhood he'd trained himself, and together they tore out the old pipes, replaced wiring, sealed leaks, and repainted the hallways. At first, the tenants were skeptical. They peeked from their doors, unsure what was happening. But when they saw Derek working late nights, smiling and talking kindly to them, they began to trust him. And when they saw Gerald sweating beside him, hauling tools and learning how to mix plaster instead of just barking orders, they started to believe something had truly changed. One evening, after a long day's work, Gerald and Derek sat on the front steps of the building. The sun was setting, casting gold light across the street. Gerald exhaled heavily. I used to think being a landlord meant control, owning walls, collecting rent, keeping order. But now, I think it means responsibility. Derek smiled. Now you're starting to sound like a man who owns more than property. Gerald looked at him. You fixed more than my pipes, Derek. Derek chuckled. Nah, he said quietly, picking up his wrench. You fixed yourself. I just gave you the tools. As the streetlights flickered on, Gerald looked around at the freshly repaired building, the laughter of kids echoing from an upstairs window, and felt something he hadn't felt in years. Peace. And somewhere deep down, he knew the truth. Sometimes the person you look down on ends up being the one who teaches you how to stand tall. A month passed, and the building on Maple Avenue no longer looked tired and forgotten. The cracked walls gleamed with new paint, the pipes hummed quietly instead of groaning, and the air smelled faintly of fresh plaster instead of mildew. But the biggest change wasn't in the bricks, it was in the people. Gerald Whitmore was still the landlord, but now when tenants saw him, they didn't close their doors. They smiled. They waved. Sometimes they even stopped to talk. And when the heat broke in winter or the faucet leaked, Gerald didn't bark orders or shrug it off. He grabbed his phone and called Derek before anyone else even had to ask. That Saturday, Derek stopped by to check on the final repairs. He found Gerald kneeling in the courtyard garden, hands covered in soil, planting marigolds in the flower beds the kids had helped dig. The sight made him grin. Well, well, Derek said, setting down his toolbox. Didn't think I'd ever see you fixing something that wasn't metal. Gerald stood, wiping his hands on his jeans. You're not the only one who knows how to work with tools anymore. Derek chuckled. Careful, you'll put me out of business. They sat on the front steps afterward, drinking coffee from paper cups. A soft breeze carried the sound of children playing somewhere nearby. Gerald said quietly, I used to think the people who rented from me were lucky I gave them a place to live. I thought being a landlord meant being above them. But now I realize I was the one who needed them. Needed to learn what it means to care about something that isn't just mine. Derek nodded. Funny thing about fixing pipes. Water doesn't care where it leaks. It just finds every crack. People are the same. You patch up one thing and you start finding all the places inside that need repairing too. Gerald smiled. Guess I had more leaks than I realized. Derek took a sip of his coffee, eyes soft. We all do. The trick is not pretending we don't. A moment of silence settled between them, the comfortable kind that comes only after two men have shared something wordless but understood. Before he left, Derek handed Gerald a folded piece of paper. Blueprint, he said. Gerald unfolded it. It wasn't a plumbing plan. It was a sketch, a design for community renovations, a rooftop garden, solar panels, an after-school repair program where kids could learn carpentry and electrical work. At the top, in bold handwriting, were the words, Miles and Whitmore Community Project. Gerald stared at it, speechless. You want to do this? Together? Derek smiled. You've got buildings. I've got hands. Let's make something that lasts. For the first time in his life, Gerald felt something stronger than ownership. Purpose. He extended his hand and Derek shook it firmly. Let's fix more than pipes, Gerald said. Derek grinned. That's the idea. As the sun dipped below the city skyline, the two men stood outside the old brownstone, once divided by prejudice and pride, now united by something far sturdier, respect. The pipes in the building no longer leaked, but something far more important had begun to flow freely again. understanding. And sometimes that's all it takes. One broken pipe, one hard lesson, and one man patient enough to fix what another refused to see. Spring came to Brooklyn like a promise. The brownstone that once stood cracked and weary now glowed beneath the morning sun. Clean brick, bright paint, new life. Kids played on the front steps. Neighbors who once avoided each other now shared stories over coffee. The Miles and Whitmore Community Project had turned what used to be an old apartment block into a place that actually felt like home. Inside, a mural stretched across the lobby wall. Painted by a local artist, it showed two hands, one white, one black, holding a single wrench together, with water flowing from it into roots that bloomed into flowers. Beneath it were the words, "Built to last." Gerald stood quietly in front of it one afternoon, his hands resting in his pockets. Derek approached from behind, carrying blueprints under his arm. "You like it?" he asked. Gerald nodded slowly. "I do. It's honest. That's not easy to find in paint." Derek smiled. "That's the point. A good foundation only holds if you tell the truth while you build it." They walked outside, where a group of volunteers, tenants, teenagers, even some of Gerald's old workers, were finishing the rooftop garden. Solar panels glinted above them, and the air smelled like soil and promise. "Remember when you told me not to scratch anything?" Derek teased lightly. Gerald chuckled, shaking his head. "Yeah, now I'm the one doing the sanding." Derek laughed. "Funny how life works. You yelled about leaks, and now you're helping me teach kids how to fix them." The two men watched as a young boy, maybe 12, carefully tightened a pipe joint under Derek's guidance. The boy looked up, proud, as the water flowed through perfectly. Gerald clapped softly. "Not bad, kid. You might be my next plumber." The boy grinned. "Or your next landlord." Derek laughed, handing him a rag. "Either way, make sure you're better than us." They all laughed together, the sound rising up over the rooftops. Later that evening, after the volunteers had gone, Gerald and Derek sat again on those same front steps, the place where everything had started. The air was warm, filled with the hum of the city and the soft rustle of wind through the flowers. "You know," Gerald said quietly, "I used to think fixing things meant keeping them from falling apart, but I think now it's about helping them become stronger than before." Derek nodded. "That's how people work too." Gerald looked at him, eyes glinting with gratitude. "I don't think I ever thanked you properly, not just for the pipes, but for showing me what kind of man I could have been all along." Derek smiled. "You did thank me. You built something that matters." They sat in silence for a while, watching the lights flicker on across the neighborhood. The old building stood solid and proud, not just repaired, but reborn. As the night settled in, Derek stood and picked up his toolbox. "Well, partner," he said, "time to see what else in this city needs fixing." Gerald grinned, rising to his feet. "You find it. I'll help build it." Derek nodded, and together, they walked down the quiet street. Two men who had once stood on opposite sides of respect, now walking the same path. Because sometimes, what starts with a broken pipe ends with a rebuilt heart. And sometimes the real repair isn't in the walls you fix. It's in the bridges you build.